Hi scientists, are you ready to do our next experiment with our material wood? Well, our focus question today is what happens when wood gets wet? Today we are going to do something called communicate. And the word communicate means to tell about something by talking or writing. And we're going to communicate what happens when wood gets wet. We're going to look at our different wood samples. Remember, this was the one where the wood is all glued together, so this is called plywood. That's our plywood sample. This is the one we learned was sawdust and shavings glued together. This is called particle board. This sample is called pine. Now I know I look at the ends, and if it doesn't have a mark, I know it's my pine. Take a look at this one. This one has a black dot, and I put black for basswood because I have a hard time telling these two apart, the pine and the basswood. And then this one is a little darker, you can see. This one has a red mark, and that is our cedar sample. So we have plywood, particle board, pine, basswood, and cedar. We're going to see if there's any difference in what happens when they get wet and what happens to the wood. So what we're going to do, we're going to use this tool. This is a dropper, and we're going to use the dropper to drip 1 drop of water, and we're going to on one of the pieces of wood, and we're going to see what happens. This is how you get the water in the dropper. You have to squeeze the bulb, then put it in the water, and then let go. Look, the water gets sucked up into the bulb. Again, I'll show you. Remember, you can either put it in first and then squeeze. It brings the water into it. Or you can squeeze first and hold it, drop it in, and then let go. You can suck up the water. Now watch me. I'm going to drop very carefully. Do you see that drop coming out? Drop. Watch again. Squeeze very gently. Drop. Look what happens if I squeeze too hard. It all comes out. We don't want a stream of water coming out. We want 1 drop. Watch me again. Littlest, tiniest, 1 drop. That's what we're looking for. Okay, I'm going to get more water in, and I'm going to show you what you're going to do. You're going to start with cedar. Let's get the cedar. That's the one with the red dot. I'm going to bring it off to the side, and I'm going to drop 1 drop onto the cedar. There's the 1 drop. Take a look. What happens? Look at it. Is it soaking in? Or we call that absorbing. That's a big word, absorb. Is the water absorbing into the wood, or is it beating up and sitting on top of the wood? Take a look. What do you think? So far, I would say it is beating up. I took my notebook and I opened it up and I said, cedar beating up. At the top, I wrote what happens when wood gets wet. You should have the focus question that I gave you. So you can glue that into the top. What happens when wood gets wet? The cedar is beating up. It still doesn't look like it has absorbed even now. Take a look. Does the wood where the water is, do you see how it looks a little darker where the water is touching it? I'm going to write the wood gets darker. Not really any change right now. Let's take our next piece of wood. Let's look. Let's look at the plywood. I'll put the plywood down. I'll take a drop of water and I'll drop one drop onto the plywood. Look at that. Also looks like it's beading up. I wrote that in my notebook too. You're going to do the same thing with all of the wood samples. Let's see what happens on the particle board. There it is, the drop of water on the particle board. And here is my pine. So far, they're all beading up. Let's look at the basswood. There we go. So we have a drop of water. Notice I did one drop on each. Let's go back to our cedar. It's still beading up, but it is starting, you can see the wood around starting to get the water absorbing a little bit. Do you see how the wood is getting darker on the plywood too? Okay, so I'm going to write my findings in my notebook. See how I wrote this? I did this and I wrote beading up. If you want to do it with all of them and just write beading up once, you can. Let's see if the wood looks darker with every sample. Definitely a little bit with the plywood, the particle board. Yeah, the wood looks a little darker there. Oh, this one looks like it's getting more absorbed. This is the basswood. Looks like it's getting absorbed faster. Let's see. We'll just leave them here and see what gets absorbed faster. Oh, look, the cedar is getting more and more absorbed. We'll see over time what happens. Okay, it's been a few minutes. Take a look. The cedar is really starting to soak into the wood. The plywood is still it's still beaded up. And look, the particle board doesn't even look like it's starting to sink in. The pine still looks like it's pretty well beaded up, but look at the basswood. It's soaked right in. Look at that. The basswood soaked in first. That was, I'm going to put that in my thing. I'm going to say soaked in first. The basswood was first, for sure. Let's see. We'll keep an eye on this. I'll keep coming back in a few minutes and we'll see what happens. It's about 5 minutes later. You can see that the cedar has really soaked in by now. The plywood looks like it's starting to soak in. The particle board, not at all. That is still one giant bead there. The pine also, whoops, is a giant bead. But look at the basswood. Let me double check that this was the basswood. Yep, black basswood. The basswood totally soaked in. The cedar still has a little bit of the drop left, but the basswood has totally soaked into the wood. And do you see how the wood looks darker where the water absorbed? That was interesting. The wood is darker. I did make a note of that in my science notebook. All right, I'm going to keep coming back. Okay, let's take a look. The cedar still has a little bit of the drop. See, you can see it from the side. You can see some of the drop. It's still not totally absorbed. The plywood is very little of it got absorbed. It's still beaded up. Look at the particle board. Hasn't even begun to absorb. Remember that the particle board is held together with a bunch of glue, right? It's not just wood. It's wood and glue. Do you think that has anything to do with the fact that not any of the water has been absorbed yet? This is the pine. The pine has spread out a little bit and is starting to absorb. But I would say, we had said the basswood absorbed fastest. I'm going to say the cedar came in number 2 there. I would say the plywood probably, the pine or the plywood, maybe the pine comes in number 3. the plywood number 4, and the particle board came in 5th. That hasn't even begun to absorb. That beaded water is just sitting on the top of that particle board. You can try this at home with your own wood samples. See if you come to the same conclusion that I came to, and go ahead and write about it in your notebook. Have a great day.